steering in real estate is illegal and you may be guilty of it. Hello everybody, it's Zach here from RealEstateLicenseWizard.com. Today we're going to look at a history of steering and discrimination, talk about why steering is illegal and how you may be guilty of it without knowing. More importantly, we'll cover what you need to know for the real estate exam and how to avoid steering in your future real estate career. Let's get started. So let's start like always by taking a look at our definition. So steering is the illegal practice of guiding or steering someone to purchase or rent a home in a specific area or community based on their race, religion, gender, color, familiar status, or disability. In essence, it is discrimination and often comes in many forms, but most cases involve directing someone of a specific race into an area by only showing homes for sale in that demographic population. A more subtle form of steering can be simply making assumptions about where your buyers would or would not want to live based on one of those protected classes that I mentioned before. The opposite of steering would be treating all buyers equally and allowing them to choose which areas they do or do not want to live in. So why is steering illegal? Well, steering has been around for centuries, but most prevalent was before the 1960s. The majority of what we know as steering occurred before the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Pre-Civil Rights Movement, steering in real estate was rampant, causing segregation of communities and ethnicities all over the country. Minorities were forced to live in separate communities because of corruption in the lending and real estate industries. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 was the first law passed to make discrimination in real estate illegal, but only applied to discrimination against race and color. It wasn't until the Civil Rights Movement, 100 years later, that real change began to take effect. Shortly after Martin Luther King was assassinated, President Lyndon Johnson pushed for the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which included the Fair Housing Act. Now, the purpose of the Fair Housing Act was to prohibit discrimination in the financing, sales, and rentals of housing based on race, religion, sex, national origin, familiar status, and disability. For the most part, it worked. And with enforcement from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, steering can result in hefty fines and a loss of license as a real estate professional. However, despite massive regulations and added protections, unfortunately, steering in real estate still goes on to this day. So let's do some examples. A blatant example of steering would be you, as a real estate agent, only showed your clients homes in an area that matches their racial makeup. But typically, it can be a lot more complex than that. So let's start with a simple, typical example. Steering example 1. So imagine buyer A is African American and comes to you looking at houses. Assuming they only want to look in areas with other African Americans, you only show homes in those neighborhoods. Again, that would be an example of steering. The opposite. Similarly, buyer B comes to you and therefore you only showed them homes in Caucasian areas because you think they would not want to live in a different socioeconomic environment. Again, that would be steering. Another example would be providing or withholding information to specific groups of people while giving different information to others. Let's look at steering based on familiar status. So let's say buyer Bill has 2 kids and is looking for an apartment. He asks you about the economic growth in your neighborhood and the crime rates. Instead of pointing him to third-party sources, you tell him that the economy there isn't growing, jobs are moving elsewhere, and someone down the street was just robbed. Buyer B, single, with no kids, comes to you next week asking the same apartment, area, crime rates, all that stuff. But because he has no kids and you don't like kids in your building, you tell him that the area is fine and there hasn't been much crime lately. Obviously, we can see that the information you gave Bob was different than what you gave Bill, simply because Bill has kids. This can apply to other protected classes as well. Say if Bob was black or Bill was white, or maybe Bob is 25 and Bill is 68. See the difference? They're all forms of steering, no matter what race or what protected class or, sex, whatever, things like that. Let's do one last example. Let's say Jacob is shopping for a house. He says he wants to be in a good school system with a low crime area, mentioning he has a family and would like activities for his kids. He then shows Agent Andy a house that he wants to look at. Agent Andy responds by saying, that's not really a good family neighborhood. I think you would like these areas better. Or, that is more of an older community. Most of the people there that live there are above 50. While it may seem harmless, and Andy is following what he thinks the buyer's guidelines are, Andy is still steering Jacob away from a specific neighborhood based on his familiar status, age, and other protected classes. As an agent, you have to be intentionally aware of what questions you answer and things you state that are opinions and not facts. Comments such as, "You wouldn't like this area," or "This neighborhood is up and coming," can seem like helpful, but they can actually be construed as steering. So, obviously, with that last example, that's where most agents get caught. The phrases agents say unintentionally and questions they answer from buyers. So please remember that. So now, what's the difference between steering, redlining, and blockbusting? Well, steering is similar to other terms you may have heard while studying for your real estate exam, and students usually mix these up. So let's start with redlining. Redlining is the denial of goods or services to people of a protected class. Redlining in real estate commonly involves lending, which is where its origin began. During the 1920s, banks would literally draw red lines on a map defining safe areas to invest or grant loans. And the majority of those red areas were in minority neighborhoods. Steering is actually a form of redlining in that you deny a service to someone based on their race, religion, familiar status, etc. Now, it's worth mentioning redlining for the real estate exam will likely refer to discrimination in the lending industry by not granting loans to people of a protected class. Now, there's blockbusting as well, which we talked about in our last video, and blockbusting is another form of discrimination, but it's different than steering and redlining. Blockbusting involves convincing sellers that the social economics of an area is quote-unquote changing in an unfavorable direction, therefore enticing them into selling their homes. It can be obvious as telling people that minorities are moving to the neighborhood, and if they don't sell now, their property values will decrease. Either way, that's blockbusting. So hopefully now you understand the difference between blockbusting, steering, and of course redlining and their relationship. So how do you avoid steering? Well, some best practices for avoiding steering as a real estate agent are to stick to the objective criteria your buyer gives you, such as price, area, size, bedrooms, etc. Ask them questions based on those criteria and refer them to third-party websites or resources when they ask about neighborhood, schools, safety, racial makeup, or religious institutions, things like that. The key to helping your clients with these potentially difficult questions is to have resources available for them to answer their inquiries. Direct them to a local school rating website, crime statistics websites, demographic maps, instead of automatically answering, even if you might even know that statistic. Don't assume. And again, the best way to avoid steering is by simply treating everyone equally. Now, obviously, in that third example, it can be really difficult to tell sometimes because you might not even be trying to do anything wrong. You might be trying to help. You might have good intentions, but you could be accused of steering unless you are conscious of what you say and answer questions appropriately. So be mindful when clients ask what you think of an area. So some common questions are, is this area safe? What are schools like? Do you think we would like this neighborhood? And what is the makeup of the area? Obviously, you should probably not answer those questions. And again, not really refer to any specific thing that would implicate you as steering. So again, at that point, just refer them to local statistics and things like that. You should be able to answer questions quickly. Remember, you're a real estate professional, so you need to be an expert on this stuff. But again, refer them to that third-party impartial resources. You yourself should not be telling somebody whether or not an area is safe or not, and things like that. Another way to ensure you are not unintentionally steering is always to keep up with local real estate laws and your state's protected classes and continually educate yourself in the industry. Obviously, laws change. When I'm creating this video, I guarantee 5 or 10 years from now, they're going to be adding other protected classes to your state's specific fair housing law. I know, for example, other states have sexual orientation included nowadays, and it's included in a lot of other states. And there are certain states that do things like income status and even going as far as like a source of income and things like that. So really, there's a lot of protected classes included in these fair housing laws, and really you need to be as fair and safe as possible and treat everyone equally. So what do you need to know for the real estate exam? Well, the most important thing for the exam you need to know about steering is its definition. Steering is the illegal practice of guiding someone to purchase or rent a home based on their race, religion, gender, color, familiar status, disability, or any other protected classes that your state might have protected in their fair housing law. Secondly, you may see the terms redlining and blockbusting, and of course steering on the exam. You need to be able to distinguish each term and how it fits into discrimination and how it works and things like that. So be familiar with those. Also, remember that these practices were all made illegal by the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Remember that. If you can remember all those things, you're one step closer to passing the real estate exam. For more on fair housing, click the video here. And if you want to subscribe, click here. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you spending time with me today. See you guys next time. Bye-bye.